Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We'll be exploring the process of reincarnation today. My guest, Dr. James Matlock, is an anthropologist and co-author with Irlander Haraldson of the book I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation. He is a research fellow with the Parapsychology Foundation. He is also a regular contributor to the online Psi Encyclopedia, sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in London. In addition, he has created an academic course called Signs of Reincarnation, which, to my knowledge, is the only such course, academic course, focusing specifically on reincarnation evidence to be offered anywhere. He is the author of dozens of academic papers and book chapters on the subject of reincarnation, anthropology, parapsychology, and related fields. And today we'll be looking at some of his own unique ideas as to the process of reincarnation. Welcome, Jim.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to be with you. This is our 12th interview, the final interview in our series. This is going to cap it off. And I want to encourage our viewers to check the program listings where they can link to your website and link to the previous 11 interviews that we've done, because we've covered reincarnation from every angle.
We've tried to.
That we can think of, based on the empirical evidence accumulated by studying the spontaneous memories of young children who remember previous lives. And in many of these cases, they're actually solved. That's the term used when a previous person is identified based on the information provided by the child. So this is an empirical study. It's an academic study. Researchers have been involved throughout the world. And your notions of how this process works are essentially grounded in the
very much so.
Empirical literature.
Yeah, very much so. Mm-hmm. My ideas about the process are derived entirely from the study of these cases, from the data. I call myself data-driven. Mm-hmm. So my theory is very much data-driven and not driven by philosophical concepts or the religious ideas are about. I didn't start with an idea. I didn't start with even the idea that reincarnation occurred. I wasn't convinced. I'd been studying this area for quite a long while, since about 1980. And yet, I wasn't fully convinced that reincarnation was the right answer. It was the only answer to the only explanation of the data until I worked out my own theory. And I did that in the course of developing the course lectures that you referred to.
Yeah. So, which means that you spent decades becoming completely imbued with the case studies before you developed a theory.
The theory, yeah, and the theory derives from what I learned from the cases. And what that also means is that the theory is grounded in data, not in religious concepts, not in philosophical concepts. Right. So therefore independent of them, isn't beholden to any of them, and may not coincide, does not coincide with all respects of any of them.
Right, and certainly including scientific materialism, which would suggest that consciousness cannot operate independently of the brain.
Right, yes. You know, it's almost, if one's going to try to develop a theory of reincarnation, one has to reject that, you know. But what the data suggests to me is that what survives death is simply a stream of consciousness that's continuous with the consciousness we enjoy in life. And as I began to think about what do we mean by consciousness, what do we mean by mind, what do we mean by spirit, what do we mean by soul, what do we mean by psyche?
Yes.
Because psyche can be a Greek word, can be translated either soul or mind. And it's translated both ways. And for the Greeks, it sort of meant both things, you know. What I came to realize is that these are all terms that converge on the same basic thing. Consciousness, mind, spirit, soul, psyche, all mean essentially at the basis the same thing. There are slight differences in meaning of each of them, but there's a convergence of meaning. And that was maybe my first major insight that helped me here, because it simplified everything. I no longer had to be concerned with with trying to understand what a soul was, what a spirit was. I had a concept that brought it all back to consciousness, to the mind. And even if we don't know exactly what consciousness is, we all experience consciousness.
We can talk about consciousness as a process.
We can, and and we don't have to introduce anything new in order to talk about the process scientifically.
And of course, now consciousness has become a legitimate area of academic and scientific study, maybe in the last 30 years or so. Really, for the first time since William James wrote his classic essay in the 1890s on the stream of consciousness.
Yes, that's true. Because psychology for decades was caught up in behaviorism, which denied consciousness had anything to do with the way we conduct ourselves.
Right.
So my concept of consciousness, though, is a little bit different in some respects from the consciousness that is studied, mostly, because a lot of consciousness studies deal with normal waking consciousness is only part of consciousness. Right. Conscious awareness is what I call it. That's only one aspect of consciousness. We also have to keep in mind that there's a huge subconscious that we all have too. And that also is part of consciousness.
The way you're using it.
The way I'm using it. Well, the way I think of consciousness. It has both a subconscious and a conscious awareness. I'm very influenced by the thinking of and work of Frederick Myers, who talked about the supraliminal and the subliminal. The supraliminal is similar to my conscious awareness, and the subliminal to my subconscious.
Now you're referring to F.W.H. Myers, who wrote the classic book published, as I recall, in 1903, The Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, is regarded as a classic in psychology. I know the British Psychological Association had a big commemoration back in the year 2003 of the 100th year anniversary of that book.
So, well, that's wonderful to hear. Yeah, he was, of course, a member of the Society for Psychical Research.
Yes, indeed. He was a psychical researcher and a great one.
Right. And so he dealt a lot with experience, with psychic experience.
And he pioneered the concept of the unconscious, that he referred to it as the subliminal mind before Freud.
Before Freud, exactly. And that's one reason why I used the word subconscious is again to distinguish my idea of from Freud. Freud used the word unconscious. But Freud's concept of the unconscious was the reservoir of repression, repressed thoughts, emotions, whatever, and it was sort of a negative conception of. So Myers was very different. Myers had a much more open, much larger, much more creative concept.
One might think maybe a little bit more akin to the Jungian view.
Yes, very much so. And I think one can now Jung went much further in talking about the collective, unconscious as well. But one can include that if one wishes. But that's not an important part of my theory here. But anyway, so that's my concept of consciousness, to include both the supraliminal conscious awareness level and the subliminal subconscious level.
Right.
And in the subconscious, I place personality, I place creativity, I place memory. I believe memory is not stored in the brain. I mean, the materialists, neuroscientists like to think that it is. They still say it is. They have the pious wish for it to be there.
Yes.
But they've never been able to find it there.
We call it promissory materialism.
Promissory materialism. It's exactly.
Someday we're making so much progress that eventually we're going to solve these harder problems.
Right. So, but I think what they're seeing when they think they've detected evidence that memory is in the brain because of this or that area that they touch and so forth, what they're in fact finding is those points at which consciousness interfaces with the brain. When we're embodied, our brains do control everything about our bodies. So it makes sense, to me at least, that consciousness would interface with the brain.
Yes.
And if memory is stored in consciousness, registered in consciousness, that the retrieval of memory from consciousness would depend in part on the brain, and that you would expect to see certain brain areas light up when memory is retrieved, and different kinds of memories are retrieved, different parts of the brain.
You're probably referring to the research of Wilder Penfield, the great Canadian neurologist who conducted experiments electrically stimulating the brains of his patients while they're engaged in surgery, and noticing that if you stimulate the brain, a memory will be described. But of course, two things to say about that. One is that Penfield never found that he could stimulate the exact same place twice and get the exact same memory.
Yeah, right.
And furthermore, Wilder Penfield, universally regarded as one of the great pioneers of neurophysiology, was a dualist. He did not believe in the scientific materialistic theory of the mind-brain interaction at all. His views were much closer to what you're suggesting here, that there's a realm of consciousness independent of
the brain, yet interactive with it.
Yes.
Interfacing with it. So at any rate, with this concept of consciousness, I believe what survives is simply the stream of consciousness. And we see the beginning of this in near-death experiences. So I don't see any need to change the structure of consciousness as we go into a discarnate state, we become disembodied. So I would.
There's a continuity.
There's a continuity, but also a continuity of structure, so that there is both a subliminal and a supraliminal level to consciousness, even when it's disembodied.
Right.
All right. Now, there may be more permeability to the line. It may be easier for things from the subconscious to come up to conscious awareness. But at any rate, I think you still have the subconscious element there in the surviving stream of consciousness.
There's still many mysteries to be solved.
There are.
William James, for example, noted that every time we go to sleep, we lose consciousness, but when we wake up, we're the same person.
We're the same people. That's right. Yeah. But to continue with this, looking again at the cases, particularly the intermission memories, which are the memories of the period between death and rebirth.
Yes.
We see a lot of evidence of continuing cognitive function as well. They talk about thinking, about making decisions, about deciding particularly on the parents.
In other words, the executive function of the mind
seems to continue.
Yes. As opposed to in dreams, where we don't seem to have very much.
Where we don't seem to have it. Where we don't have that supraliminal element at all. It's just totally
unless it's a lucid
subliminal.
dream.
Unless it's a lucid dream where the mind comes in and takes control. And but so some theorists have suggested that the discarnate state is sort of dreamlike. I reject that. I don't see. I think it's. I think the evidence points to
based on the accounts of the intermission state.
Right. And I think it's clearly has to be subjective. But there's another something else which is still at play during the discarnate state is the ability of the mind to exercise its psi, and this is very important.
Psi,
of course, ESP on the one hand, and PK
or psychokinesis
on the other hand.
Matter.
On the other hand, and that allows for interaction, telepathic interaction with other spirits. It allows for clairvoyant perceptions of the material world, and it allows for psychokinetic actions upon the material world.
And if I'm correct, I think you probably also feel that in the discarnate state, the mind's ability to work with psi is greater than in the incarnate state.
Well, that would follow, wouldn't it? Because when we're incarnate, we have these other senses. We have our physical eyes, we have our ears, and they sort of take over. And so psi recedes to the background, becomes more elusive. When we're discarnate, all we have is psi. So it has to be a more subjective state. On the other hand, with psi, it also becomes objective. I mean, we can perceive, other streams of consciousness. We can interact in various ways with other humans, embodied humans, and with the material world.
Now, I suppose it's fair to say at this point, your model, which seems consistent with the empirical evidence and certainly would go a long way to helping us understand the reincarnation process. It also leaves many more questions unanswered than it really answers at this point.
Well, it does, but it's a starting point.
Yes.
I mean, it provides. But one thing that this does is it gives us an alternative to thinking about what survives in terms of an astral body, a subtle body. Because if I'm right, all you need is the mind to carry forward memories, to carry forward images, to interact with the world. You don't need a subtle body to do any of this. You don't need a subtle body even to hold anything together, which is one of the philosophical arguments for a subtle body.
Yes.
All you need is your stream of consciousness, having both a subconscious and a conscious level to it. So to proceed on to reincarnation.
Yes.
What is involved there is, as we talked about earlier when we were talking about possession, if we define possession as simply the possession of a body by a spirit, not necessarily a replacement of another spirit, reincarnation by its nature is a possession. And so what happens then, I'm proposing, is the stream of consciousness comes into alignment, comes to possess a new body. And that can be at any stage. It could be at conception. It can be during gestation. It could even be, as we've discussed, there are cases that suggest a replacement type of reincarnation.
After birth.
After birth.
Yes.
But in any event, it's the stream of consciousness that's coming to possess the body. And if that's the case, it's bringing to the new body the subconscious line, including the memories, including the personality, including everything, about the earlier person.
So this would, I would imagine, also account for the birthmarks and physical deformities and other things that are observed.
It can, I believe, in this way. we know a lot now about how the mind can affect the body.
Yes.
And through mental healing, through, in various ways. And
in particular, the hypnosis research shows that warts and blisters and skin conditions are especially susceptible to mental suggestion.
Suggestion, that's right. They can be created, they can be uncreated, they can be resolved that way too.
It's as if the skin itself is an extension of the nervous system.
Right. The body itself is an extension of. I don't think that it's out of line to suggest that the mind does this through psychokinesis. That's how the mind interacts with the brain and the body. So the incoming mind, with the images of its late body, I believe can impact its new body through psychokinesis to produce birthmarks, birth defects, drive internal diseases, things like that, which carry forward, as we've talked in earlier interviews, from previous lives, and so it doesn't require a subtle body. Stevenson talked about a psychophore, which is like a subtle body, which he understood to carry form forward, so that the birthmarks and birth defects, or the birth defects at least, would be carried in the psychophore, and the psychophore he saw as the template. This is the term he used, the template for the new physical body.
And there are different researchers in the field of, sometimes it's called energy medicine, and the study of subtle energies and so on, who propose things like this.
Like that.
There are many proposals of this sort.
Right, there are. The problem with all of them, though, is that they don't allow for the joining of the spirit to the body after conception. They presume that it comes at conception, that it provides the template that was, Stevenson talked about it, for the body. If the body is already being formed, how can the incoming mind be a template, provide a template for it? So it makes more sense to me to say the body, which is formed in the way that we understand very well, through genetics, through through sexual intercourse, leading to the generation of the body, the production of the body. It makes much more sense to me to say that that's the template, and that the incoming spirit, the incoming mind, customizes that template.
What's the
customizes that template, to use a modern sort of. So that's how I explain birthmarks and birth defects.
Well, that makes a certain amount of sense. I'm sure our viewers will all have many, many questions about the details of this process. In particular, how the disembodied consciousness is able to interact with the physical world at all
through Psi. Is my answer.
Well, and which is a nice word. Parapsychologists have used the word Psi for a long time, but it's really only a word. We don't have a theory of Psi.
Right. We don't. But I'm saying that Psi is a property of consciousness. And that takes us somewhere towards a theory. Because many parapsychologists don't get there, it seems to me. They don't quite get to the point that Psi is just an innate property of consciousness as such. And so, because many parapsychologists don't really credit survival, I think they're doing themselves a disservice. Because as I understand it, Psi, because it's so important, so central to a discarnate mind, I think the answer to Psi, to the meaning of Psi, to the purpose of Psi, lies in its purpose, its advantage for a discarnate mind. And it's only, and the reason that Psi is so elusive when we're embodied is that it's not our main way of perceiving and interacting.
Well, I think you've come up with a coherent explanation. It's an explanation that's grounded in the case studies, and that alone is very important. Researchers have been studying and thinking about consciousness since the days of Plato and before, and they probably will continue for several more thousand years. It's a great mystery still.
Yes. We haven't, and there are many aspects of consciousness that I don't deal with. But so I'm just dealing with one limited aspect of it.
To be able to come up with a coherent model that explains the process of reincarnation
and doesn't require overturning anything that we've learned in conventional mainstream biology or psychology.
Makes as few assumptions as necessary. That's really what you've done here.
And so when I figured this out, and it was step by step in developing my course, then I came to realize, well, there's no reason to hold back any longer. I figured it out, as it were, at least to my satisfaction. And I don't see any other way to explain all of the data that we've been talking about.
Well, and you know what? I've tried to look at other ways myself, as you know. I've come up with an alternative model, and I tried to push the archetypal synchronistic resonance model as far as I could to see, can it really account for these cases of the reincarnation type, as Stevenson called them. And you've done a pretty good job of convincing me that it
just doesn't. It explains certain types of cases. As I mentioned before, as I acknowledged before, your case, I think, does fit it. In many adult cases, it does. It helps with cases that are basically just synchronistic. But it doesn't really work when you get down to the children and you get to develop memories and behaviors and all these physical defects. It's at that point that it fails.
And one way or another, in every area of science, you're coming up against the mystery of existence itself. There are such large questions, such as why does anything exist as opposed to nothing? So those questions remain to be solved, but you've done a very credible job, I think, of looking at the process of reincarnation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Is there anything else we should add at this point?
Not that I can think of. I think we've gone through the...
Well, Dr. James Matlock, it has been a great pleasure and an honor for me to be able to introduce you and your work to the New Thinking Aloud video audience. I hope that these 12 interviews that we have now done have a long life in the...
Well, I hope so, too. I feel quite honored to be invited to be part of this.
Well, I'm delighted that you came, and I think this material is extremely important for all of our viewers. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart.
Well, and thank you.
And thank you for being with us.